I'm Liz Bailey, and I have the privilege to be up here with Maureen Ohlhausen. There's Maureen. Hi, Maureen. Maureen is the co-chair of Wilson Sonsini's Antitrust and Competition Practice. In 2012, Maureen was confirmed by the U.S. Senate as the commissioner of the FTC and was appointed acting chairman of the FTC at the start of the first Trump administration, a role she held until May 2018. Maureen has testified over 24 times before Congress, and she's won numerous awards, including the Robert Potofsky Lifetime Achievement Award. I'm going to jump right into it so we can get back on track, on schedule, into the past, present, and future of antitrust in the U.S. So, Maureen, let me start with this. Recognizing it's still early days, what are your thoughts about the potential direction of antitrust enforcement under the second Trump administration?
Well, Liz, thanks for having me. Thanks to CRA. I'm delighted to be participating. Sorry I can't be there in person. I think we have somewhat passed his prologue impact or ability to predict for the Trump 2 administration. But I think there's also been some big changes in the antitrust landscape over the past 4 years that will be addressed in the second Trump administration. So I think one of the things we're going to see is a bit of a return to regular order in merger review. I think the new second Trump administration will be an active enforcer. We see so far the president, or the incoming president, has stated that he will nominate Gail Slater to be head of the Antitrust Division. Gail, if you don't know her, is a very accomplished antitrust lawyer, many years of experience in private practice, I believe close to 10 years of experience at the Federal Trade Commission. She's had in-house experience. She worked in the previous Trump White House. So she's bringing, I think, a very accomplished, well thought out antitrust approach to the Antitrust Division. We'll see who gets chosen at the FTC, but we already have in place Andrew Ferguson and Melissa Holyoke. They are Senate confirmed. So either one could step up to be a permanent chair or an acting chair. And they have both spoken about wanting to have an active antitrust agenda. But when I mentioned return to regular order, I think one of the things that we're going to see is a turn away from overall suspicion of mergers. We had, I think, in the Biden administration, there was a viewpoint that mergers overall were not that beneficial. They took things out of the merger guidelines that had been in there for many years, talking about the benefits of mergers. That was removed. And so I think we're going to see maybe a more nuanced approach to focusing on mergers that are going to be anti-competitive, going back more of a focus on the consumer welfare standard. But I think it's no surprise, we saw it already in the president's announcement of Gail Slater, the continuation from the first Trump administration with a focus on big tech, right? And are there competitive actions, mergers, activities that the big tech companies are taking that should have additional antitrust focus? So I think we'll see that continuity from the previous version of the Trump administration to the second one.
Are there certain priorities that the new administration can change quickly and things that'll take longer? Like how fast or slow do we expect to see these changes happen?
So certainly there are some priorities that can take place very quickly, turning away from certain areas of focus. So for example, I don't think private equity will be a focus apart from concerns that certain acquisitions or series of acquisitions are anti-competitive. I think there'll be sort of a turning away from the idea that private equity just as a business model is problematic. I think a focus on labor issues unrelated to an impact on competition in the marketplace and consumer welfare standard. I think there'll be a turn away from that. Competition rulemaking, that was a big focus Chair Khan. We saw that in the rulemaking on the non-competes. I think that will fall by the wayside. It's already enjoined. It's kind of in a precarious state. So I don't think we'll see any more of that. One of the other things, we saw a lot of this at the beginning of the Biden administration, and I think we might see kind of a mirror image approach in this one. Rescissions of some broad policy statements at the FTC, the unfair methods of competition policy statement, I think will probably be rescinded and rethought. So I think those are things that can be done very quickly. Some of the other changes, if there want to be changes to the HSR rules themselves, we saw Commissioners Holyoke and Ferguson, when those rules came out, kind of identifying, well, if I were doing this just, kind of had 100% of what I wanted, they would look different. So I think there'll be a question. Those rules are supposed to take effect in February. Will there be a way at the beginning of the administration to perhaps hold those rules back to make those kinds of changes? I don't think we're going to see an immediate rescission of the merger guidelines, which are now combined horizontal and vertical merger guidelines. I think we'll see maybe some case selection and then eventually probably a rethink of those guidelines, because there are things in those guidelines that some of the current Republican leadership have mentioned that they like, including a focus on potential competition. So those kinds of things, the rules, the changing the HSR rules may be more time consuming and have a little more administrative challenge. But anything that's a guideline, a policy statement, the kind of choice of discretion, right, enforcement discretion, those can be made immediately.
And what about international cooperation? Do you expect that's going to be a priority, or is that another area of active disagreement?
I think there's going to be a rethink and maybe a reassessment of some international cooperation. One of the things that we saw criticisms of the current administration, and we saw this come out of the House report under Chairman Jordan, focusing on concerns about perhaps some of the international cooperation mechanisms might have been used to expand the authorities of the U.S. agencies outside what Congress has granted them. There's going to be a big focus across the board, whether it's international or it's domestic, on are the agencies exceeding the authorities that Congress has granted them. There's a big focus on the administrative state, and certainly the agencies are part of that. It'll be a big, wider focus that'll cover a lot of different areas, not just antitrust. But I think international could fall in that bucket. I think we've also seen, going back to the previous Trump administration, President Trump raised concerns about some of the enforcement in Europe. I think he called Margaret Vestager the tax lady at one point, and he also made some comments about impacts of U.S. remedies being sought in cases, whether that would benefit foreign rivals like China. So I think some of those kinds of issues will be something that gets some careful attention in the new administration.
Is that the same as saying that the Trump administration might use antitrust as a way to facilitate protectionism? Well,
I think what they might say is, let's take a look at whether antitrust is being used that way against U.S. interests. And if it's being used that way against U.S. interests, then perhaps there should be a assessment of, is that fair or should things change, right? We see that a big interest in trade issues, in tariffs. I could sort of fall into that bucket of looking at, are there U.S. interests being disfavored? And then how do you address that? Do you address that by, fighting fire with fire? I think might be the question.
Let me, I'm going to try to keep us back on track. So I want to ask a question for those who follow U.S. antitrust activity. There's two agencies. There's the Department of Justice Antitrust Division and the Federal Trade Commission, in particular the Bureau of Competition. There's been rumblings over the years of consolidating the Bureau of Competition into the Department of Justice, and some of those rumblings have gotten louder. Since you were chairman at the FTC, and those rumblings happened, through the time you were there too, what do you think about that? Is the train speeding up on that, or is this just more rumblings?
I think some of the actions taken by the FTC under the Biden administration has led to a lot more energy coming behind some of these proposals to, there's the One Agency Act, which would take away the FTC's antitrust authority and put it over at DOJ and make the FTC purely a consumer protection agency. When I was at the FTC, one of the things I tried to pay close attention to was the fact that you had two agencies enforcing essentially the same law, and to try to minimize the the disparities that could result from that. Pursuing things under a different PI standard, right? Tried to keep it under the same PI standard, not using the ability to go into administrative litigation as an extra lever, sort of extra leverage against emerging parties in a way that DOJ couldn't use it. I think the current administration has tried to use those tools more aggressively, and there is this now pushback and concern that perhaps it's creating an even bigger divergence between the agencies, and does that make sense? And should there be more of a single approach? One of the other things that I mentioned, the focus on the administrative state and separation that goes to separation of powers issues in the U.S. with our three-part system, is whether one of the reasons you had the FTC was the idea, when it was created, the idea it would focus kind of as an expert body and do administrative litigation, and it would have kind of weak remedies like a cease and desist order, and kind of going forward, companies would say, okay, now we know where the rules are. Now we know where the boundaries are. Well, there is a lot of pressure now on the idea of having an agency do both enforcement and administrative litigation, and then kind of sit as somewhat of an appellate body on cases that it had voted out. So if that FTC authority for administrative litigation were to fall by the wayside, then again, that kind of creates this idea of like, why do you have two agencies? Why was it created this way? Does that still make sense? So I think between sort of the focus on the administrative state and the frustration with some of the ways the administrative or the FTC process has been used by the current administration has sort of supercharged what's been bumping around for a number of years, which is a push to just make kind of rationalize to a single agency for antitrust.
Thanks for that. Maureen, I really appreciate you zooming in to join us this afternoon or this morning where you are. Thank you. I appreciate it. I know everyone here appreciates it as well. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks.